A racist neighbor calls the police to handle a black man who had just moved into her neighborhood, deeming him unsuitable without realizing that he is the newly appointed sheriff of the area. When the truth is revealed, her shock is palpable, leaving her utterly stunned. Stay tuned to witness this heartfelt story about justice delivered meaningfully. Nestled among ancient oak trees, the Maplewood neighborhood was the crown jewel of a small town. Its winding gravel roads were flanked by meticulously preserved classic homes, evoking a sense of nostalgia and tranquility. Most residents had known each other for years, greeting one another warmly whenever they crossed paths. Monthly neighborhood meetings were a tradition, a forum for sharing everyday stories and collectively maintaining the peace they so valued. However, beneath Maplewood's friendly exterior lay the lingering conservatism of some older residents. For them, even the smallest changes posed a threat to the orderly life they were accustomed to. These individuals often gathered in the afternoons at the corner cafe, discussing and dissecting every little development in their area. Among them, Margaret Simmons stood out. Margaret, a woman in her 50s, had lived in Maplewood for nearly 3 decades. She epitomized the ideal of a committed resident. Her pristine white house and vibrant garden bursting with colorful blooms were not just her pride but also the pride of the neighborhood. Margaret didn't just care for her own home, she actively monitored community affairs, often reminding neighbors about maintaining cleanliness and upholding Maplewood standards. Yet, behind her meticulous facade was a woman bearing scars from the past. A few years prior, a young family had moved into the house across the street. They were dynamic, with a lifestyle that differed significantly from most Maplewood residents. Initially, Margaret had tried to get along, but a minor misunderstanding over shared land usage spiraled into a heated dispute. The family left after just a few months, leaving Margaret with a lingering sense of failure and unease. Since then, she'd grown more suspicious of outsiders, always worried about the potential for unwanted disruptions to the neighborhood's harmony. That morning, as usual, Margaret began her day with a steaming cup of tea and her favorite book on the bench in her garden. The chirping birds and the fragrant blooming roses enveloped her in a familiar calm. But that calm was quickly disrupted when a large white moving truck slowly pulled up in front of the house across the street. Margaret raised her head, her brows furrowing. A group of movers began unloading items from the truck, carrying them into the house that had been vacant for months. This was an unexpected development for Margaret, who prided herself on knowing everything that happened in her neighborhood. "Who are they? Why didn't anyone tell me about this?" Margaret muttered, her gaze fixed on the scene before her. Moments later, she saw a tall, confident man step out of a sleek black SUV parked behind the truck. The man exuded an air of self-assurance, dressed in crisp, tailored clothing that didn't align with Margaret's image of typical Maplewood newcomers. She squinted, unease beginning to creep in. Margaret set her tea down on the table, went inside, and drew back the curtains in her living room for a better view. Retrieving an old pair of binoculars from a drawer, she began watching the activities of the unfamiliar group. As she observed, memories of past incidents flooded Margaret's mind, amplifying her weariness. She resolved to keep a close eye on the situation, driven by her self-imposed duty to protect Maplewood. And so, a peaceful morning in Maplewood marked the beginning of an unexpected turn in Margaret Simmons' life. Margaret remained by the window, her eyes glued to the scene outside. The tall black man emerged from the sleek SUV, radiating an air of elegance in his pristine white shirt and sharply pressed trousers. He spoke to the movers calmly yet authoritatively. The workers quickly followed his instructions, efficiently unloading large crates and expensive-looking furniture into the house. Who needs so much furniture? Margaret wondered aloud, her unease growing. She noticed the items being brought in: a luxurious leather sofa, large paintings, and even a grand black piano. Her curiosity deepened. What kind of person lives like this? He won't fit in here. While she was fixated on the activity outside, the sound of her doorbell startled her. Quickly pulling the curtain shut, Margaret went to answer the door. Standing there was Laura Jones, her longtime friend, holding a freshly baked apple pie. "Good morning, Margaret," Laura greeted cheerfully. "I brought you some pie. What's got you looking so tense?" Margaret sighed, pulling Laura inside and pointing toward the living room window. "Look over there," she whispered as if someone might overhear. Someone just moved into the house across the street. A man. Not the kind of person we usually see here. Placing the pie on the table, Laura walked over and peeked through the curtains. The man was still directing the movers with a calm yet commanding presence. Oh, so there's someone new moving in. But why are you so worried? He seems fine. Maybe he's just busy and hasn't had a chance to greet the neighbors yet. Margaret shook her head. No, Laura. Didn't you see how he was giving orders to the movers, like he thinks he's the boss of everything? Laura chuckled softly, attempting to ease her friend's anxiety. Margaret, you're overthinking this. He's just a new neighbor. For all we know, he could turn out to be a great addition to the community. Not everyone introduces themselves right away like we do. Margaret turned to Laura, her face etched with doubt. But what about the house? You remember what happened with the Petersons. I can't help but think trouble is brewing again. We don't need more chaos. Laura considered this for a moment before nodding slowly. I understand why you're concerned, but sometimes you need to give people a chance. Let him settle in first. If there's truly an issue, you can talk to him directly. Still unconvinced, Margaret muttered, You don't understand, Laura. Something feels off. He moved in without greeting anyone or giving notice. Who knows what his real intentions are? Laura laughed lightly, trying to shift the mood. Margaret, you might need to relax a bit. I'll leave the pie here. Call me if you need anything. After Laura left, Margaret resumed her post by the window, continuing to watch the house across the street. She saw the man retrieve a large bag from his SUV. The way he moved and handled his belongings seemed efficient and professional, only fueling Margaret's suspicions. Who is he? Why does he need such a big SUV? And why doesn't anyone in the neighborhood know anything about him? Margaret muttered, her mind racing with conjectures. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret couldn't tear herself away from the window. Each new item carried into the house sparked a fresh wave of speculation. Her unease peaked when she noticed a large wooden crate being carefully placed in the living room by two movers. Through the slightly open window, Margaret muttered, I'll have to find out more. I can't let Maplewood face trouble. Margaret resolved to keep a watchful eye on her new neighbor, the sense of duty to protect her neighborhood consuming her thoughts. As the evening light blanketed the Maplewood neighborhood, Margaret stood at her window, her eyes fixed on the house across the street. Her hands gripped an old pair of binoculars she had found in a drawer earlier that day. The new neighbor, Michael, continued unloading items from his sleek SUV. This time, he carried a large black box with sharp, squared edges. It looked heavy, and Michael used both hands to carefully lift it. What is that? A box hiding some kind of secret? Margaret wondered, her imagination conjuring increasingly sinister scenarios. Michael walked into the house, placed the box on the floor, and opened the lid. Through her binoculars, Margaret could only glimpse long metallic objects inside that resembled some sort of equipment or specialized tools. Tools or weapons? Margaret thought, letting her mind race to the worst-case scenario. Her heartbeat quickened. She quickly moved to another window to get a better view, but her line of sight was obstructed by a wall inside Michael's house. Just then, the ringing of her landline telephone startled her so much that she almost dropped the binoculars. She set them down on the table, adjusted her hair, and answered the call. This is Margaret, she said, her voice still slightly shaky. Margaret, it's me, Laura, came the familiar voice of her close friend from the other end of the line. I just got home. How are you? I'm guessing you're still keeping an eye on the new neighbor. Yes, and you won't believe this, Laura, Margaret said, lowering her voice as if someone might overhear. He just brought in a huge box, and I have no idea what's inside it. It doesn't look like anything ordinary. There was a pause before Laura chuckled lightly. Margaret, it's probably just personal belongings. A big box doesn't mean he's up to something shady. No, you don't understand, Margaret replied, her tone growing more resolute. Did you see the way he moved it? So careful, so secretive. I have a feeling he's hiding something.
Laura sighed on the other end of the line.
You're letting your imagination run wild, Margaret.
But if you're worried, why not call the police? They can check it out and confirm if everything's fine. Call the police?
Margaret repeated, her expression revealing her inner conflict.
Yes, Laura continued. If you feel uneasy, that's the best way to put your mind at ease.
But remember, don't make a big deal out of it unless you have a valid reason. When the call ended, Margaret sat down in her chair by the window, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. She looked outside, where Michael was speaking to the movers before they left. They shook hands and exchanged smiles, but that didn't put Margaret at ease. She placed the phone back on the table and picked up the binoculars again.
This time, she saw Michael stepping into the yard, dragging out another box smaller but equally enigmatic.
He set it down by the car, opened the lid, and began pulling out what appeared to be tools for repairs.
Repair tools or something more dangerous? Margaret tilted her head, trying to get a better view. Her mind continued spinning narratives of potential threats.
Finally, Margaret set the binoculars down and let out a heavy sigh.
Laura's advice echoed in her mind, call the police.
But if she was wrong, it could make her look like a fool.
But what if I'm right?
Margaret muttered to herself, her heart heavy with doubt. Margaret took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the phone again.
She dialed the number for the Maplewood Police Department, and after 2 rings, a warm female voice answered. Maplewood Police Department. How can I assist you?
Hello, this is Margaret Simmons, she began, her voice laced with tension.
I'd like to report some suspicious activity in our neighborhood. Suspicious activity?
The dispatcher's voice was calm but inquisitive.
Can you provide more details, ma'am?
Margaret glanced out the window, where the lights in Michael's house still shone brightly. A man just moved into the house across from mine, she explained, her tone growing firmer.
He's brought in a lot of large items, including boxes I can't see inside. He's acting very strangely, and I don't think he belongs here.
The dispatcher paused briefly before responding, her tone measured.
All right, ma'am.
We'll send a patrol unit to check it out.
Can you give me the exact address? Margaret quickly provided the information, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension.
When the call ended, she set the phone down, her eyes once again drawn to the house across the street. Inside Michael's home, he was on the phone himself, his tone calm but carrying a hint of seriousness. Yes, I just moved in today, Michael said, holding a small notebook in which he appeared to be jotting down notes.
Everything's fine. I'll get everything settled in the next few days. No major issues, just a bit more time to organize.
He paused, listening to the voice on the other end, then smiled faintly. No, I don't anticipate any trouble, but I'll be ready if anything comes up.
That last statement, though seemingly innocuous, would leave viewers intrigued.
Back in her home, Margaret sat, staring at her now cold cup of tea. I'm just doing my duty, she muttered, her mind a tangle of emotions. Outside her window, the lights in Michael's house burned brightly, a constant reminder that Maplewood's peace was now under challenge.
Taking another deep breath, Margaret pulled the curtain shut.
The police patrol car rolled slowly through the quiet streets of the Maplewood neighborhood. Inside, Officer Mike Williams glanced at the slip of paper with the address written on it sitting on the dashboard. Another call about suspicious activity, he said, his tone laced with mild exhaustion. In the passenger seat, seasoned Officer Tom Anderson chuckled softly. I bet it's just like the last few times, a nosy resident thinking someone doesn't fit the image they have for this neighborhood.
Mike nodded in agreement.
Calls like this rarely turn into anything serious, but we've got to check them out.
Remember that one last week?
Just a young guy smoking outside his girlfriend's house, and someone thought he looked shady.
Tom laughed quietly. Yeah. At least that one didn't take long.
We just showed up, asked a few questions, and it was over. In the back seat, Rookie Officer Emily Grant listened attentively. This was her first time handling a call like this, and she couldn't help but feel curious. Why do we have to respond to calls like these if they're usually not serious, she asked, her voice tinged with genuine interest. Tom turned slightly to look at her, his gaze both kind and sharp. Emily, even if a call seems minor or trivial, our job is to make sure people feel safe. Sometimes just showing up is enough to ease someone's unfounded worries.
Mike added, and not every call is a waste of time.
Occasionally, calls like these lead to important discoveries.
Our job is to never assume and always be prepared. Emily nodded, absorbing the wisdom of her experienced colleagues.
Still, a small part of her wondered whether this particular call would prove to be necessary or simply another routine check. The patrol car slowly approached the Maplewood neighborhood, where charming old houses lined both sides of the street. The area was so quiet that Emily could hear the wind rustling through the tall oak trees. Mike pulled the car up in front of a white-fenced house with neatly trimmed hedges. On the porch stood a woman, her posture stiff and her face filled with concern. "That's Margaret Simmons," Mike said, glancing at the address on the paper for confirmation.
"I've handled a couple of calls from here before."
"She's known for keeping an eye on everything." Tom nodded, stepping out of the car and adjusting his utility belt.
"All right, let's take it easy.
Residents like her usually just need to see us take action to feel reassured." The three officers approached, and Margaret quickly descended the steps to meet them. Her face betrayed her anxiety, but her eyes were resolute. "Good evening, Mrs. Simmons," Tom said first, his voice calm and professional.
"We received your call. What seems to be the issue?"
"Thank you for coming so quickly," Margaret began, her voice trembling slightly. "It's the man who just moved in across the street." She pointed to Michael's house. "He's brought in so much furniture and these large boxes. I don't know who he is, but his behavior, it's very strange.
I don't feel safe."
Tom and Mike exchanged glances but maintained their composed demeanor.
"Did you notice anything specific that made you feel concerned?" Mike asked.
Margaret hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I can't say for sure, but the way he acts, it's so secretive. I don't know what he's up to, but I think you should check it out for the safety of the neighborhood." Standing nearby, Emily listened carefully and jotted down notes. She studied Margaret's expression, wondering if this was merely an overreaction or if there was truly something amiss. "All right, Mrs. Simmons," Tom said, his tone reassuring.
"We'll take a look. Please stay here while we handle it."
Margaret nodded, though her eyes remained locked on Michael's house as if she were expecting something to happen. The three officers crossed the street and approached the house. Through the brightly lit windows, they could see Michael organizing his belongings.
He moved back and forth, occasionally pausing to examine items on the floor.
"This looks like an ordinary day for someone who just moved in," Emily murmured, striving to keep her tone neutral. "Maybe," Tom replied, his voice low and cautious.
"But we can't jump to conclusions. You never know what might come up."
Mike rapped lightly on the wooden door, the sound clear but not aggressive. They waited, their gazes fixed on the interior as Michael's silhouette paused and turned toward the door. "Be ready," Tom said quietly, his eyes serious but not tense.
"We don't know what we're walking into."
The wooden door opened slowly, and Michael stepped out with a calm and composed demeanor. He wore a deep blue sweater and simple jeans, exuding an air of confidence and approachability. "Good evening, officers," Michael greeted, his voice deep and warm.
"How can I help you?"
Tom Anderson stepped forward, maintaining a professional stance, while Mike stood slightly behind, his observant gaze reflecting his years of experience.
Emily Grant lingered nearby, quietly taking in every detail.
As she looked at Michael, a sense of familiarity flitted across her mind. "Good evening, sir," Tom replied evenly. "We received a call from a neighbor reporting some suspicious activity related to your move. We're just here to check and make sure everything is all right." Michael raised an eyebrow briefly but then chuckled softly.
"I see.
I just moved in today and might have caused a bit of a stir."
"I'm simply unpacking and organizing. There's nothing to worry about." Mike nodded, glancing over Michael's shoulder into the house.
Through the doorway, they could see a living room filled with neatly arranged boxes and some furniture already in place.
"Are you moving in alone?" Mike asked, his tone gentle but still cautious. Michael smiled and nodded. "Yes, just me. I'm still settling in."
Honestly, this is a fresh start for me, and I hope to get to know the neighborhood over the next few days. As Michael spoke, Emily squinted slightly, trying to recall where she had seen him before. His face looked oddly familiar, but she couldn't immediately place him. "Where did you live before this?" Tom asked, his tone still professional but now tinged with a hint of warmth. "I came from the next city over," Michael replied, gesturing toward the living room. "A new job brought me here. I thought Maplewood would be the perfect place to settle down." Michael's response prompted Tom and Mike to exchange a subtle look, as if something had just clicked. Standing behind them, Emily's eyes suddenly widened as realization dawned. The name Michael Carter surfaced in her memory, and she instantly understood why his face was so recognizable. Emily started, unable to hide her surprise. Michael turned to her, his expression friendly. "That's right, I'm Michael Carter," he said, a smile spreading across his face. "I'm set to take over as the town's new police chief starting next week." His words momentarily caught Tom and Mike off guard, but then they both broke into relieved laughter, their expressions visibly relaxing. "So you're the new chief we've been hearing about," Tom said, shaking Michael's hand firmly. "It's an honor to meet you, sir." Mike also extended his hand, grinning broadly. "We heard about you from the top brass, but we didn't expect to meet you like this. Looks like we've been investigating our new boss." Michael laughed heartily, his deep voice radiating charisma. "That's all right. I appreciate your professionalism. I'm looking forward to working with a dedicated team like yours." Emily stood quietly, a slight smile on her lips as the tension melted away. She now saw Michael Carter not only as a capable leader but also as someone approachable and grounded. As the truth emerged, the atmosphere lightened considerably. Yet it sparked an intriguing question: if you were the neighbor who called the police, how would you feel upon learning the truth about Michael? Meanwhile, from a distance, Margaret kept a watchful eye on the activity unfolding on Michael's porch. Through the glow emanating from his front door, she could see the police officers conversing easily with him. The tense atmosphere she had imagined was nowhere to be found. The way they laughed and shook hands left her utterly confused. Margaret furrowed her brows, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why are they being so friendly? Could they have ignored the suspicious behavior I reported, she wondered. As Michael and the officers stepped out onto the porch, Margaret decided to move closer. Just as she approached, she overheard Michael saying, "Thank you for stopping by to check on everything. I completely understand, the safety of the neighborhood is very important." Tom and Mike nodded, their expressions tinged with humor. "It's great to meet you, Chief. We're looking forward to working with you," one of them said. The statement hit Margaret like a bolt of lightning. She froze in her tracks, her eyes widening in shock. "The police chief? He's the new police chief?" Michael turned to Margaret, his gaze calm yet sharp. He walked toward her, maintaining a polite smile, but his tone carried a distinct gravity. "Mrs. Simmons, I'm guessing this call came from you. Am I right?" Margaret fumbled, her cheeks flushing crimson. I just thought I was protecting the neighborhood. I didn't know." Michael raised a hand gently, signaling that she didn't need to explain further. "I understand, and I genuinely appreciate your concern for community safety," he said, his voice steady but meaningful. "However, if anything concerns you in the future, I hope you'll consider speaking directly with me first. It's always better to address things openly and avoid unnecessary misunderstandings." Margaret lowered her head, unable to hide her embarrassment and regret. I'm sorry. I just didn't want anything bad to happen in Maplewood." Michael nodded, his tone remaining composed. "It's all right. I also want the best for this neighborhood. I hope we can get to know each other better moving forward." Just then, Laura appeared from across the street, her steps brisk. "Margaret, what's going on here?" she asked, her gaze darting from Margaret to Michael and the officers. Margaret turned to Laura, her voice trembling. He's the new police chief." "I didn't know." Laura shook her head, a mix of disappointment and remorse flashing in her eyes. "Margaret, I think you've gone too far this time. I understand you were worried,
But maybe we need to learn to trust people a bit more. Michael offered Laura a courteous smile. It's all right. Everyone has a right to feel concerned when someone new moves in.
I'll make an effort to get to know all the neighbors in the coming days. Laura turned to Margaret, gently placing a hand on her shoulder.
Margaret, I think you owe Michael an apology. It's the right thing to do.
Margaret nodded slowly, her heart heavy with guilt. She looked up at Michael, summoning her courage to speak. I'm truly sorry, Mr. Carter. I was wrong to judge you without any real reason. Michael inclined his head, his voice soft.
It's all right, Mrs. Simmons. Everything's fine now. I just hope that next time we can talk directly.
The police left after ensuring everything was resolved, but Margaret remained rooted to the spot, her legs feeling as if they were glued to the ground. Her mind churned with confusion and shame. Waves of regret washed over her, drowning out any coherent thought. Laura stood beside her, clasping her hand lightly in an attempt to comfort her.
Don't be too hard on yourself, Margaret.
But next time, let's make sure we fully understand the situation before taking action, Laura said, her tone gentle yet subtly admonishing.
Margaret simply nodded, unable to find her voice.
Her gaze lingered on Michael's house, where the lights inside still shone through the window. She could see Michael's silhouette moving about, likely rearranging his belongings. She took a deep breath, but the weight in her chest refused to lift. Images from the evening replayed incessantly in her mind, from making the call to the police to the moment the officers uncovered the truth about Michael.
What have I done?
Margaret asked herself, her heart heavy with self-reproach.
The officers' parting words echoed in her head. He's the new police chief of the town.
This was an unfortunate misunderstanding. That statement, while explanatory, felt like a subtle rebuke, leaving Margaret feeling exposed and judged. Laura stayed close, her expression a blend of empathy and concern. Margaret, you acted out of concern for the neighborhood. But sometimes we need to take more time to understand things before we act, Laura added, as if trying to ease her friend's conscience. Margaret remained on Michael's front lawn, her eyes fixed on the door that had just closed. The light spilling from his house illuminated her face, highlighting the whirlwind of emotions she couldn't hide. She stood there, her heart squeezed by shame and a storm of conflicting thoughts. The silence around her was so profound that she could hear the rustling leaves in the gentle breeze, but in her mind, the images and words from earlier continued to swirl.
I was wrong.
Completely wrong, Margaret admitted to herself, waves of embarrassment rolling over her like a relentless tide. She recalled the moment Michael calmly spoke to the police, each of his words radiating understanding and grace, devoid of any resentment. His eyes, steady as they met hers, held a composure that Margaret found astounding. How could he be so gracious when I was the one who put him in this position, she wondered, guilt sinking deeper into her chest. The memory played back like a slow-motion reel. She remembered Michael's words, I genuinely appreciate your concern for community safety. But in the future, I hope you'll speak with me directly. Those words, simple yet profound, reflected the haste and prejudice in her actions. If I had been more patient and open-minded, perhaps none of this would have happened, she thought, regret simmering like a quiet flame within her. As darkness gradually enveloped Maplewood and the lights in Michael's house went out one by one, Margaret remained there, her feet unwilling to carry her home. She gazed around, her eyes landing on the familiar details of the neighborhood, the houses, the trees, the winding paths leading to hidden corners, places she had always believed she knew better than anyone. Yet now she realized that her rigid mindset had clouded her view of what Maplewood truly represented. Under the faint glow of a nearby street lamp, Margaret's weariness was apparent. She wondered what Michael thought of her actions. Will I have the chance to make this right, she asked herself, imagining the days ahead and the prospect of facing Michael as a neighbor. The thought made her heart sink. Yet amidst the storm of negative emotions, a small spark of realization began to glimmer. Margaret understood that Michael wasn't just another neighbor. He had come to Maplewood with a greater purpose, not only to live there but to bring meaningful change. His poise and the humane way he handled the situation had taught her a lesson she hadn't previously considered. Maplewood doesn't just need protecting, it needs understanding and trust, Margaret mused. This new perspective gradually seeped into her thoughts, like a soothing balm.
Margaret began to see things differently.
She no longer fixated solely on her embarrassment but also on the opportunity to change, not just for herself, but for the way Maplewood functioned as a community. If Michael can forgive and extend his hand, then so can I, she resolved, a small but firm determination taking root in her heart. Margaret lingered outside Michael's house, gathering her composure after the encounter. The front door opened once more, and this time a graceful woman stepped out, followed by a cheerful little girl about 10 years old, her face glowing with curiosity. "Margaret, let me introduce my family," Michael said, his voice warm and inviting.
"This is my wife, Samantha, and our daughter, Chloe. They've just finished unpacking and wanted to come out and say hello."
"Hello," Samantha Carter smiled and extended her hand toward Margaret.
"It's a pleasure to meet you. Michael has mentioned what a lovely neighborhood this is, and we're excited to become a part of it."
Margaret hesitated for a moment, taken aback by Samantha's kindness.
"Oh, hello, Mrs. Carter.
"It's very nice to meet you and your family," she stammered, trying to maintain a neutral tone while masking her lingering embarrassment.
Chloe, a petite girl with neatly braided hair, beamed brightly and stepped forward. "Hi there. I'm Chloe.
We just moved in, and I can't wait to get to know everyone around here." Her lively voice and innocent enthusiasm immediately lightened the atmosphere. She looked around and waved at a few neighbors who had gathered nearby.
"I love drawing and playing soccer. This neighborhood is so pretty. I hope we can be friends."
Jessica Brown, a young neighbor who had been observing from a distance, couldn't resist smiling at Chloe's friendliness. She stepped closer and crouched down to Chloe's level.
"Hi, Chloe. I'm Jessica. I love drawing too. Maybe we can draw together sometime." "Really? That sounds amazing,"
Chloe exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Samantha turned to Margaret, her gentle smile never wavering.
"We're eager to build good relationships with everyone here.
Please don't hesitate to reach out if you ever need anything." Margaret, still grappling with her earlier misjudgments, looked at Samantha and Chloe, then shifted her gaze to Michael. The worry and mistrust she had felt earlier seemed to dissolve. This family, she realized, was nothing like what she had imagined. More neighbors who had been watching quietly began to approach to introduce themselves. An older gentleman from next door spoke up.
"Welcome to Maplewood, Mr. Carter. If you need anything, feel free to ask. I'm John, and I live right over there." Another middle-aged woman chimed in. "Chloe is such a darling.
I'm sure my kids will love playing with her."
Michael smiled warmly, shaking hands with each neighbor. "Thank you, everyone. We're truly happy to be here."
Chloe continued chatting enthusiastically with Jessica and a few other children who had joined her. Her openness and sincerity seemed to melt away any remaining hesitation among the neighbors, bridging the initial divide that her family had faced.
Margaret stepped back slightly, watching the interactions unfold. She exhaled deeply, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't experienced all evening.
She realized how quick she had been to judge Michael and his family without giving them a chance. A new feeling blossomed within her, a hope that the Carters would indeed become an integral and cherished part of Maplewood. "Well, Michael," Margaret said, her tone softer than before.
"I think I was wrong about you. Welcome to the neighborhood."
Michael turned to her, his sincere smile radiating gratitude.
"Thank you, Mrs. Simmons. I look forward to being good neighbors."
The atmosphere in Maplewood, which had been tense throughout the day, now felt warm and inviting. Samantha and Chloe's friendliness, combined with Michael's calm and understanding demeanor, had shifted perceptions and broken down barriers. For Margaret, this marked not just a change in how she saw the Carters but a deeper reflection on herself and the community she had sought to protect. This wasn't just the beginning for the Carter family, but a fresh chapter for Maplewood itself, a place where understanding and connection triumphed over assumptions and division.
The next morning, Maplewood was as tranquil as ever.
The soft rays of the early sun filtered through the towering oak trees, casting a golden glow on the tidy houses and narrow streets of the neighborhood. Birds chirped melodiously, their songs blending with the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, making the morning air feel refreshingly serene. From her porch, Margaret noticed an unexpected sight. Michael, dressed casually in jeans and a simple t-shirt, was standing in front of Mr. Johnson's house a few doors down. The two seemed engaged in an animated conversation. Mr. Johnson, a small elderly man with white hair, had lived in Maplewood for decades. Age had taken its toll on him, leaving him unable to manage necessary repairs around his home. Despite its nostalgic charm, his house showed signs of wear, with areas that needed maintenance. Moments later, Margaret saw Michael retrieving a large toolbox from his SUV. Without hesitation, he began working on the wooden fence in front of Mr. Johnson's house, which had been damaged during a recent windstorm. From a distance, Margaret observed Michael diligently at work. He carefully sawed through broken wooden planks, replaced damaged sections, and even repainted the entire fence, leaving it looking as good as new. Other neighbors soon took notice as well. Jessica Brown, who had maintained a positive view of Michael from the start, approached Mr. Johnson and exchanged a few words with him before assisting Michael with organizing his tools. Margaret couldn't take her eyes off the scene. She watched as Michael smiled and chatted with Mr. Johnson, his voice filled with warmth and enthusiasm. Every action Michael took radiated sincerity, not as a performative gesture, but as genuine kindness.
A wave of unease and guilt washed over Margaret. What was I thinking, she wondered. How could someone like him ever be a threat to this neighborhood?
The sight of Michael working hard and engaging so naturally with Mr. Johnson was a stark contrast to the image she had constructed in her mind. Hours passed, and the fence stood restored clean, sturdy, and looking brand new. When the work was done, Michael washed his hands and shook Mr. Johnson's hand firmly.
"Thank you, Michael."
"I don't know what I would have done without you," Mr. Johnson said, his voice thick with emotion. Michael chuckled softly, patting Mr. Johnson on the shoulder.
"It's nothing, Mr. Johnson. I'm glad I could help. If there's anything else you need, just let me know."
The scene didn't just touch Mr. Johnson, it caught the attention of several neighbors who began approaching Michael to chat. Slowly, they began to see him not just as a helpful neighbor, but as someone eager to integrate and contribute to the community. Margaret stood motionless from a distance, a strange feeling stirring within her. It wasn't just the shame of having judged him wrongly, but also a newfound admiration for Michael, someone who had, in a short time, proven to be a valuable member of Maplewood. As Michael and the other neighbors continued their lively conversation, Margaret retreated toward her house. She paused on her porch, watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of relief.
Maybe I need to do something to make amends, she thought.
Margaret went inside, her thoughts still swirling. For the first time in years, she realized that protecting the neighborhood didn't mean mistrusting change or shutting people out. Sometimes, it required opening up and embracing new things that could bring positive transformations to the community. In the days that followed, as Michael and his family settled into Maplewood, he decided to host a small gathering at his home to get to know the neighbors better. Invitations were distributed to every household, accompanied by Samantha's warm smile and Chloe's infectious enthusiasm. News of the event spread quickly, sparking a quiet excitement among the residents.
Margaret found a neatly folded invitation in her mailbox.
As she picked it up, her hands hesitated. Her eyes scanned the meticulously handwritten message. "We look forward to welcoming you to a small gathering at our home. This is an opportunity to get to know each other better and build a stronger community. Sincerely, the Carter family."
Margaret sighed, still feeling hesitant.
She had observed Michael over the past few days and seen not only his politeness but also his willingness to lend a hand, as evidenced by his help with Mr. Johnson's repairs. However, the lingering embarrassment from her initial judgment made the idea of facing Michael directly seem daunting.
That evening, Michael's house glowed brightly with soft music wafting through the air.
From her window, Margaret could see neighbors arriving, faces lit up with smiles as they chatted and mingled. After a few minutes of inner turmoil, she finally draped a light coat over her shoulders and stepped out of her house.
"I can't keep hiding.
This is my chance to make things right," she resolved. As Margaret approached the house, Chloe was the first to notice her. "I'm so glad you came," Chloe exclaimed, her voice brimming with excitement as she took Margaret's hand and led her inside.
Michael's living room was modestly but warmly decorated. Samantha stood near the refreshment table, greeting everyone with her signature grace.
Michael, dressed in a simple shirt and slacks, was engaged in conversation with a group of neighbors. When he noticed Margaret, he smiled warmly and walked over.
"Mrs. Simmons, thank you for coming," Michael said, his tone genuine.
"I hope tonight gives us all a chance to connect."
Margaret nodded, feeling a weight lift from her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I thought I should take the opportunity to get to know you and your family better." The gathering unfolded in a joyful atmosphere.
Samantha introduced an array of homemade dishes, from waffles to fruit salads, adding a personal touch to the evening.
Chloe flitted about the room, chatting with the other children and filling the house with laughter.
Toward the end of the evening, Michael stood in the center of the room, raising a glass of wine to capture everyone's attention.